Hi, I'm Jonathan Roth. Welcome to Geopolitical Futures video. I'm joined by George Friedman from Austin, Texas. George, thanks so much for joining me.
Hi, Jonathan.
I wanted to talk to you today about something that happened back on August the 6th, 1945, and that's the date that the United States dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima that was the beginning of the end of the Second World War. You wrote an incredibly fascinating piece about what happened around that incident and what it's meant for the world since, titled "The Terrible Magic of the Atomic Bomb." I wanted you to go in depth on what you feel was this terrible magic of the A-bomb and what this has meant for the world since.
The terrible magic is that you can suddenly be alive and then you and everything about you ceases to exist. The terrible magic was not that 100,000 people were killed. 1,000 bomber attacks on Tokyo killed that many people. There had been massive destruction throughout World War II. What was different about this is that it appeared almost magical. Magical in the worst sense of the word. That at one moment, everybody in Hiroshima got up to start their day, and the next moment they ceased to be. And this haunted the world and has continued to haunt the world since then.
Well, there's something that you addressed in the article that I want to go talk a little bit more about right now, and that's this debate that's been, I think it's grown louder and louder as we've moved further away from the actual incident, and that's the rationale between about why the United States dropped the bomb, and whether it was to try to show Russia that the U.S. was the predominant power in the world, or if it was actually to end the war. What's your take on all of that?
Well, first let me say that a great deal of what was developed, the story of the bomb, really developed not immediately afterwards, but in the 50s and the 60s. In the 70s, it turned against the United States, trying to make it appear to be a monster. But then in the 1980s, the archives in Japan were opened, and an entirely new story, very different from the original one, was told. The story had been that the Japanese had peace feelers out to the United States, and the war was already over. Yes, they had peace feelers out to the United States, very vague ones. One through the Russians, who didn't forward it, and one through the Swedes, which were very hard to understand. But they were really peace feelers. What the Japanese were saying is, we're not going to surrender. We're going to negotiate a peace treaty. And in some of those discussions, they said in the peace treaty that they were going to continue to occupy China. And one of the things that's left out of the equation was the Japanese had a huge military force in China. It was still operating. It had a major offensive underway at the time of the bomb, and it was killing tens of thousands of people. So left out of the equation was, one, the Japanese wanted to hold on, not only to the government, not only to hold home islands, but the parts of China, and that they were waging a war with massive forces. This was not a nation that saw itself as defeated. Now, out of that, the United States had to reach a decision. What we had learned in Okinawa was that U.S. forces would encounter such resistance, both from the kamikazes attacking the Navy and the people on the ground, that there were massive casualties. There were 50,000 casualties taken on one island. When the United States looked at the Japanese home islands, they thought we could easily suffer 250,000, even more casualties if they resisted. And the Japanese believed this too. The Japanese view was they could either deter an American invasion or defeat it on the beach by inflicting such heavy casualties on the Americans, they would capitulate. And the Japanese view was, yes, we'd have 10 times as many, but as they showed in Okinawa, they were prepared to do this. At the same time, the Americans were facing the fact that their best troops, who had fought in North Africa, who had fought at the Guadalcanal, who had fought in Normandy, they were tired of war. They did not want to be hurled into this morass of Japan. So Harry Truman was caught between that and the fact that the fear that unless Japan capitulated, they'd be back in the situation they were with Germany right after World War I. Germany did a peace treaty, then they rebuilt, and there we were in another war. So the problem was, he didn't want to invade. He didn't trust the Japanese not to reemerge as a challenge. And he welcomed the atomic bomb as a solution that would probably kill less people on the beaches, less Japanese, and less Chinese than the bombing, than the invasion.
Is it not instructive also, I think this is something that you mentioned in the piece, and that's the fact that in 1940, 1941, the Japanese were making overtures to the U.S. for peace at that point, at the same time that they were getting ready for Pearl Harbor.
The Japanese were deep in some sort of peace negotiation when they struck at Pearl Harbor. But this wasn't the first time. That's how they had opened the war with the Russians in 1905, with a surprise attack and no warning. Given all that, the United States had no trust in any Japanese vague openings. They saw them as possible ways to delay the attack and increase their ability to defend it. The Japanese never came forward and said, I will surrender, because in fact, now that we know the archives, they didn't think they had to surrender. The majority of the government didn't feel that it was at a point where they were going to lose control of the country. And it was only, not after Hiroshima, but after Nagasaki, when it was apparent there were two of these bombs at least, that the Japanese felt they had to capitulate. Until that point, the emperor had not spoken against the war. He had remained pro-war, in effect. He spoke against the war only after it appeared hopeless. He had been believing what many of the Japanese believed. They had learned in Okinawa that the United States could suffer massive casualties, and that if they could do the same thing on the beaches of Kyushu and Honshu, they could get the Americans either not to invade at all or to be defeated on the beach.
So since the second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, no one has used an atomic weapon in warfare since. And this is held all the way through to this very day. But obviously there's a lot of concern about what's happening with North Korea and a lot of these other countries as more and more nation states join this nuclear club, so to speak. Where is this going? Do you foresee the potential that these weapons will one day be used, or can we put the genie back in the bottle?
Well, the extraordinary fact about the nuclear weapons was that virtually everybody in the 1950s was absolutely wrong. In spite of the fact that the United States was using the war in Vietnam, in spite of the fact that the Soviets were losing the war in Afghanistan, in spite of the fact that Mao Zedong was quite mad, none of them used the bomb once they had it. It had a huge sobering effect. Even Mao, who really was a very strange person and said many strange things, including, what does it matter if we lose 300 million Chinese in a nuclear war? We will still be 500 million or some such number. As strange as he was, the Chinese became very cautious. The magic of the bomb, part of it is terrible, but part of it is amazing, is made everyone cautious. Without a nuclear weapon, I don't think a third world war would have been avoided between the United States and the Soviet Union. But the presence of the nuclear bomb made both sides enormously cautious. So as terrible as the bomb is, and it is a horrifying thing, it has a kind of virtue in limiting what people do. Now, you have North Korea, which rationally doesn't want a war. But then you ask the question, is Kim Jong-un, Mao Zedong, or genuinely out of his mind? And now you have to take a bet, not on strategy, not on the enemy's military, not on the army. You have to take a bet on the sanity of one guy, and that is a tough bet to make.
It sure is. Well, Dr. Friedman, thank you so much for your time and your insights. A great article. Look forward to speaking with you again next week.
Take care.